Right, so this is a report, as Clive has indicated, that's been quite a few months in the making, and it certainly didn't actually begin as a study in what are the implications of COVID, because COVID didn't exist when we first had the conversations about maybe just thinking quite hard about the transformation that Geelong has undergone in terms of its economic structure, but also this idea that Geelong has been subject to very significant shocks over its economic and social history, in particular its economic history, but yet it seems to be able to bounce back. And so the idea of resilience, why has it been a place that manages to not only come back, but to kind of reinvent itself in a very productive and positive fashion? So what I'll be doing today is talking briefly about the origin of the study and also acknowledging some of the other contributors to it, because it certainly wasn't just my work. And then I'll walk you through the four parts. The first part is very much looking at the transformation in the economic structure of the city, and you're probably very familiar with that, and I direct you to the longer report, which has now got a great deal of detail about the various economic sectors and how they've basically changed over time. Then we'll go on to the analytical part to just try and tease out the why. Why has Geelong apparently been able to not only survive but thrive and to transform itself? And then we'll look at some of the implications of COVID, especially as they were registered internationally from obviously February, March in this year, as well as nationally. What are some of the trends that have been accelerated as a consequence of COVID? What are some new developments? What are some of the lessons that we might take from other places, other initiatives that we might be able to learn from and perhaps apply in Geelong? Then we'll actually have a look at Geelong specifically, Geelong in 2019 and then Geelong in 2020, to just try and draw out what are some of the major changes, what are some of the major challenges. And from all of that, basically put a number of recommendations before you, and there's 15 of them, and at each of the ends of the four parts I'll be kind of signalling some of the recommendations that fall out of those sections, so they won't all come at you in one very long and somewhat overwhelming list. So they're recommendations that build on the analysis that I've done, as well as on the national and international exemplars, as well as thinking about, well, where can Geelong go in a really productive way to not just be resilient, but to certainly this idea of building back better. So the origin of the study, clearly it's something that really did become even more urgent and important as a consequence of the pandemic, which really did present the whole world, including us, of course, with significant social and economic consequences and challenges. And the impact of it forced a whole lot of different sectors to move, to act quickly and to adapt to the new economic and social realities. And this paper, this research paper, is very much not only a piece of research, but it is meant to actually stimulate discussion across the region, across the city, in terms of, well, what does constitute resilience? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the initiatives that can actually be progressed in response to COVID and where we're at? Building that upon the historical analysis of how and why Geelong has bounced back from major economic disruptions in the past and how these might be applied to the future. So the Committee for Geelong, as you've heard, commissioned this report, or Deakin and myself, to do this report, and how we might inform a recovery. And it comprised an extensive literature review, which I conducted, but also with the assistance of Dr. Meg Mundell, who I need to acknowledge as the person who did a great deal of the international scan of the academic, but also what we call the grey literature, because there wasn't enough time to get academic literature out in the early parts of this year. So there's a huge amount of kind of popular and grey and investigative work by economic operations and different countries and so on. And I acknowledge that Meg put that together. I also had access to a series of economic bulletins that the City of Greater Geelong made available, and I thank Hayley Ince for that access. And of course, we then looked at broadening this study, and it became a much bigger and deeper study than I think was initially intended. And I further wish to acknowledge the incredible input from the Committee for Research Geelong Research Working Group, and in particular the work of Rebecca Bartel, who's been absolutely phenomenal in elaborating on really important parts and doing a lot of really good fact checking. So I'm fairly confident that the report's in pretty good shape on that front as well. So then, what's in the report? What's the nature of the analysis that's been done? Well, first of all, this notion of resilience, and of course, there's quite an extensive literature which the report does go into a little bit. And a nice quick definition is the idea of the ability of a place to absorb, to adapt, and to transform in the face of a major economic shock. So it's not just about absorbing and somehow or other coping. It's actually about doing something else. It's about adaptation, but it's also about transformation. That's what I'm presenting as this idea of resilience. And Geelong, as we know, and people who've lived in the city for a long time will know, that it has basically survived huge shocks. I did my PhD on the textile industry over the 70s and 80s in Geelong. I then did a great deal of research with people who've been displaced from the car industry, as well as some people involved with the service sector as it started to expand. There's been the collapse of the Pyramid Building Society. And of course, there's been major closures of the big manufacturing plants, the Fords, the Alcoas, the International Harvester. And so Geelong has managed to not only endure these huge shocks, but it's kind of come back. It's been able to absorb, but also adapt, and been able to, with a few exceptions, it's only been a few years when Geelong has not grown in terms of population and economic kind of output. And so it's actually been a tale of great success and therefore resilience. And so even the Productivity Commission, national body, has recognised Geelong as one of the most resilient regions in the country, being able to adapt to these various shocks. And the big question is why? What is it about this place, and what's emerging in this place which will even allow it to adapt and to transform even more successfully? Well, the key drivers in terms of the kind of broad economic pattern is this notion of a diversified economy, which basically means that it's an economy that's moved from being quite based on manufacturing to now being quite broadly based on a range of different services, but also still manufacturing is there. So Geelong is actually distinguished by having quite a broad economic array of activities and sectors. But it also has what's called smart specialisation, and this is a very big deal in the EU as a concept, and it's one that's also being mobilised by a group who are looking at the Latrobe Valley and presenting that as a strategy for the Latrobe Valley. And certainly you can see in the history of Geelong and its economic transformation that smart specialisation, namely really building on areas that Geelong is good at. And we're increasingly good at things like advanced manufacturing, building on the manufacturing base, but also, of course, insurance. And you could actually add other sectors, and I would suggest even things like health and perhaps even tourism. So there's a series of areas of kind of focus and specialisation that a recent report by Andrew Beer, who looked at what he called mid-sized cities, really does argue is a very key element of kind of resilience for smaller cities. But I would argue in Geelong's case, it's been both a diversification strategy and a smart specialisation strategy that has contributed to its resilience. And in terms of the big patterns, you've been around for a while, you'll be very aware of what's gone on here. So this is just a graphic representing the period from 2006 to 16, and apologies for the typo in terms of my graph there. Manufacturing being the big loser in terms of employment over that decade, but obviously quite a lot of growth happening, especially healthcare, social assistance, as well as in education and training, public administration and safety. So those really big sort of administrative and education, health kind of sectors, but also the professional and technical service areas. and the accommodation and food services very much related to the tourism economy. And of course, when you get expansions in these areas, you of course have to build stuff, which explains why construction is clearly an expanding sector of the economy. And this is just a graph that actually digs down into the detail, because if that's the ABS looking at the kind of the big picture, what I had through care of Haley Inc. at the COG was a whole lot of very detailed documentation of which particular companies in which particular sectors both took on people and lost people over these 40 or so years. So it's a kind of an interesting, somewhat bumpy pattern. Interesting, in 2008, obviously the global financial crisis hits Geelong, but then you can see towards the more current environment that Geelong has clearly added a great deal more than it's lost in terms of employment, especially from about 2015 onwards. So there's something happening here. And in terms of digging further into this analysis, the economic resilience is obviously based on the economic structure of the place, the idea of diversification and smart specialisation, but it's also about people. It's about the social organisation, the community of this place does make it special. And so what is it about the enablers? And basically I'm arguing in the report, and these elements are unpacked in a lot more detail in the report, that population growth has been absolutely critical. Geelong has had a very, very rapid growth over the last 10 or 15 years. That immigration has come primarily from Melbourne, as well as from the coastal regions, as well as from more broadly based regional Victoria. And that's obviously significant, and it becomes even more significant as we think about the COVID impacts in the future. Another very, very key part of the story is government. The role of government in the resilience of Geelong and other regional centres, but especially Geelong, has been absolutely critical. A series of industry policy interventions, regional policies, decentralisation, worker support and retraining interventions, and there's a very large number of these, and it's in millions and millions and millions of dollars, as well as very concerted, deliberate policy interventions that has helped Geelong transform and remain resilient. And finally, but not insignificantly at all, because in fact, would government policy and these interventions have happened in the scale and in their ongoing way without the leadership that's been provided by a number of key organisations, including your own, G21, the committee, the City of Greater Geelong, Manufacturing Council, as well as some of the other key organisations in the region, like the university, like the airport, have all been absolutely critical, and especially around a united voice. There's research that says if you have a whole lot of division and debate within your community, then you really can't effectively lobby. You really do need priority lists, and you need to go in with a united and strong voice, and you need to lobby. And what also makes Geelong very successful on this is a couple of swinging seats, both federally and state. So they do listen, the politicians who basically hold the reins not only of power, but of economic largesse. So in terms of what do we take from that? Well, some of these recommendations flow from that analysis. So the support for diversified specialisations. So here we have both a diversified economy, but also that there's specialist elements of this, which of course need further support and expansion. The population juggernaut, which is so important to Geelong, and it's so important to Victoria and Australia as a whole. So, I mean, for the next year or two, I mean, I think the country and the whole state will be in deep trouble getting out of the recession because of the lack of international migration. But Geelong has benefited primarily not so much from international migration, but by regional migration into it. And so I think there's a real opportunity, and again, I'll explain why it's even better now, post-COVID, for Geelong to boost its attractiveness to migrants from Melbourne and the surrounding areas, to really build on that existing trend. The whole united voice, again, absolutely critical. It's already registered in things like the City Deal. There's also the Gateway Cities Alliance and some of these other victories that have been achieved through the united voice. But there's one other sort of element of Geelong which is sort of not totally apparent from what I've been saying up to this point. But Geelong does have issues of social disadvantage. It has particular localities which people do know are disadvantaged. It also has issues around high school completion rates, which are significantly lower than the rest of the state and nationally. In 2019, the region did have quite high unemployment, much higher, not much higher, but certainly higher than Melbourne and Victoria. And so there's a real need to kind of target assistance into unemployed people, both long-term unemployed, but also those newly made unemployed and displaced by the COVID impacts, but also an ongoing challenge, which I know the City of Geelong is seizing this opportunity to really understand and to implement policies and practices that can really do something about their social and spatial disadvantage in the region, because basically it holds it back. And resilience is indeed something that the region not only has, but it needs to, of course, be broadly based socially. It needs to be shared across the region, the city. So the third part deals with the national, but also particularly the international trends and responses to COVID-19. So here, of course, I'm indebted to Meg Mundell's work. And so the global trends that have kind of been either pushed into existence or accelerated or in fact even created by COVID. So a lot of this stuff is very, very new. Deglobalisation, I mean, there was a sense, and in fact I've written about globalisation feeling like a very inevitable process that was just going to keep going, and we were just going to get more and more integrated into global systems, supply chains, migration networks and so on. But what we've got right now is in fact deglobalisation, a sort of even a questioning of free trade, which may probably not be a good thing, but certainly there are, of course, migration has stopped around the world. There's a sense that the countries around the world are looking inward rather than outward. We've also, as a consequence of COVID, discovered or rediscovered government. Australia has actually got a very long history of big government and government interventions, but over the last 20 or so years, or in fact probably even back to the 80s, the rhetoric around government has been very much about the withdrawal of government, about small government, about neoliberalism, which has been about lessening government intervention, selling off government assets. But COVID has actually seen government triumphant, of intervening, of acting, and where government actually acts effectively, which it clearly has in Australia, we get the virus under control, basically. And so health becomes the new wealth. Health is now so very important, whereas we obviously took a lot of it for granted beyond the occasional illness or people who have chronic kind of conditions or aging or whatever. Now health is something we all are far more aware of. There's been a crisis for the whole society, of course, but in particular for Gen Z and the millennials. It is the young who have been impacted by COVID. It's been uneven geographically, it's been uneven socially. So women, as well as particular parts of the world, have been hit much harder than others. But some of the other things that have happened, so we've all been talking for years about how the technologies around allow us to work at home, but it was always a very, very small component. It was less than 10%. We now know that at least 30% of the workforce is working from home, and it could well continue. In fact, there's very strong indications that home-based working will indeed continue, even for those very large operations that would normally occupy inner city office towers. They're basically saying to their workforce, work from home for a couple of days a week. Telehealth has been, again, on the agenda for a long time, but we now, of course, all just do it as a matter of course. The consequence of COVID is very much, obviously, an economic recession, which in turn has generated lower pollution and fossil fuel use. So in a way, it's kind of allowed us to move into that kind of greener direction. The other thing that it's done is that, again, we've known for decades, for example, that climate change is a huge problem and challenge. And the experts, the climate scientists, are basically united in their view, but we're not particularly listened to. We're not taken seriously. So the expert, and in particular places like the United States, the expert is even demonised and dismissed. it's all fake news. What COVID has done, it has foregrounded the health expert, the public health expert, the epidemiologists. And not only has it foregrounded their knowledge and expertise, but governments, the sensible ones, have listened. And that's been a huge change. So there's been some really fundamental shifts around these different aspects. Now, more locally, what's been going on nationally here is an exodus from the cities. And this is real. It's happening in Victoria. There has been very much a desire to move out of the big cities to rural and regional communities. There's obviously, of course, a need as a result of COVID and the dislocations for a major recession, close downs and so on, to basically retrain the workforce that's been displaced. There's been a whole lot of new initiatives to try and address the recession that was being generated by COVID around public procurement, about buying local, this notion of paying forward. So it's about supporting your local area. And that is indeed something that's occurred, partly because I'm in Melbourne. We weren't allowed to go anywhere else but our local area for 6 months. But it's actually happening kind of naturally. People are not moving around because of the fear of this epidemic. We've also seen not only the existence of co-working spaces, but their possible expansion in this new world. What we've seen is active transport growing. So people have left public transport, but up to more recent times, they've left their cars and much more involved with walking, with cycling, with localising their lives, and more activity around greening the city, taking this as an opportunity as the city closes down to green, to improve its environment. And here we also have the idea of greening the circular economy, of literally having manufacturing, which is actually reshoring, and we actually have the possibility of a new green economy being really boosted. But we also have this prospect, and it's one that I know the committee is particularly interested in, and it was an example from Lille in France, who developed in response to COVID-19 a health charter. And it built on the very, very good health infrastructure in the city. And they basically worked between the health authorities, the local government authority, the tourism authority to create, and also local businesses, tourism business, to create a charter of how can you actually engage with these localities in a healthy way, using this notion of the health charter. And so we've got some really interesting ideas from offshore we might well be able to utilise in rebooting, say, the local tourism economy and expanding it in this now health-aware world that we're going to live in. One of the other things that's happened overseas is interventions to really address things around affordable and social housing, addressing disadvantage, addressing homelessness. And what happened in Melbourne happened in lots of other places, that literally the people who are rough sleeping, the most visible face of homelessness, were literally taken off the streets and accommodation was provided, and hopefully that will be kind of extended along with wraparound services. And Geelong, of course, is also very involved with this whole social housing agenda. The idea of building back better, with social inclusion very much on the agenda again. And finally, recognising that the creative industries have not only got a role to play in terms of economic revitalisation, but community rebuilding, community reconnecting. I've been in my house for basically 6 months and not really allowed to interact with any other people. And so this idea of the arts coming back and becoming able to reconnect people, and also boosting the attractiveness of Geelong as a culturally rich, creative city. And also the idea of being the UNESCO City of Design. Let's think about how we can actually design the city itself better around these new trends of localisation, of digitisation, and so on. And maybe even use the Urban Design Challenge as something that allows Geelong to build back better. So that's the third part, and a series of recommendations that provide, that flow from that. It's basically about, again, connecting displaced workers to relevant online training and reskilling programs. The idea of really capitalising on the anxiety around metropolitan living. to literally boost the attractiveness, the marketing of this region for the in-migration of not just people, but also businesses wanting to decamp out of Melbourne, out of other metropolitan centres. Build on the trends for more home-based work and commuting, much less of that, not every day, but some days a week, localisation and the flexible working hours. So around the whole localisation of work, the flexible home at work idea. Boosting onshore manufacturing. So a set of policy interventions building on the university, industry, government collaborations that have been detailed in the longer report, and a set of incentives which are already flowing, as we know, from even the state budget and the federal budget, to literally not just reboot manufacturing and other industries, but taking the opportunity to really grow the advanced manufacturing sector, the green, the circular economy. And then possibly Geelong becoming a site for this fairly large zero emissions project, which is one being basically championed by the Atlassian entrepreneurs. More recommendations is about the boosting of tourism through this idea of the health charter, supporting the arts and the cultural industries, but not just in the city, but also the notion of the high streets, and revisiting the Renew Geelong idea to activate vacant spaces in both retail areas and other industrial areas, not again just in the city, but throughout the city. Build in the notion of active transport, especially cycling networks. This idea of Melbourne's meant to be building itself around the 20-minute neighbourhood. Geelong could build itself around the 10 to 15 neighbourhood with green, sustainable localities in both existing but also new areas. Social housing construction and renovation, expand some of the models we already have, implement the City of Greater Geelong social housing policy. It's there, it's rolling out. There's $200 million additional money about to go into social housing. It is a fabulous opportunity, and it's not just about the construction sector. Of course, that's really important. It's also about social inclusion and really revitalising those areas of social and spatial disadvantage. It's a huge opportunity. And again, it's consistent with these trends that I've described. Finally, the fourth part was looking at Geelong in 2019, where Geelong was growing quite steadily. It was actually one of the fastest rates of growth in the country at 2.7%, which is actually quite remarkably fast. There were very buoyant economic sectors. The health, education, public administration, tourism, even manufacturing was buoyant, despite those other earlier years of mass kind of layoffs. There were positive developments around infrastructure. There was the city deal. And commuting was something that, I mean, large numbers of people go from Geelong to Melbourne. But in fact, as somebody who works at Deakin, I've come from Melbourne to Geelong, and I've noticed that there's increasing flows the other way. 6,500 daily go the other way from, in fact, Melbourne to Geelong. So there's a lot of good things happening, but there were still some challenges. So there's relatively high unemployment. There's the numbers. This low education and participation rate is a real challenge. If you want your area to be smart, if you want your area to really grow around the new technologies and the new industries, then the Year 12 completion rate is really a challenge. And finally, the social disadvantage areas that I've already alluded to. The impact of COVID, a bit hard to tell in terms of really good numbers and data on this. We know that 26,000 jobs were in accommodation and food, education and training, arts and recreation. So all of those jobs were very, very vulnerable. And there were predictions of between 30 and 50% of those jobs actually going, or at least going on hold. 10,000 jobs had already gone by the middle of the year. And it was predicted that the regional economy would lose between 7.5% and 10% of domestic product over the year. But despite those pretty massive impacts, and the impacts of unemployment were across the whole city, they weren't just confined to areas where unemployment often is concentrated, there was an ongoing inflow of people and interest from people from outside, as indicated by the real estate domain and so on, who monitor this stuff. A lot of interest in Belmont, Geelong West and Jan Juc, and actually some of the highest levels of interest across the country with those localities. You're also getting quite a lot of inflow of people moving into still the coastal areas, but also more recently, the pages of the financial papers have indicated that the suburban growth corridors are also getting quite a lot of interest still from people wanting to move into Geelong. So it's very possible that Geelong can build on its strong history, its economic structure, its location, and these new trends to benefit from this extraordinary challenge, and therefore to affirm its resilience. So how do we predict the future? Well, of course, it's impossible, but thinking about the economy, the locational issues, the challenges of social inclusion, to build on the existing strengths, on the smart specialisation in advanced manufacturing, in tourism, in health, public administration, and ensure that the various networks are all lined up here to kind of lobby for appropriate government policies and interventions to support all of this. And the trends, of course, I guess we just need reminding here that we're dealing with a different, a greener, but also a digital economy coming out of COVID. We're talking about a world where life is now localised. We have a city, we have a region, we have a state where there is a decentralisation of people and activities from major cities and the CBDs of cities. Melbourne is still struggling. It's still, as a city, not anywhere near. It's about 40 to 50% at this stage, and we're out of lockdown. We actually obviously have a revolution in online digital ways of working and being, in shopping, in healthcare, in how we work, in how we consume the arts. And the quest, of course, is for health and safety as well as social inclusion. So they're all elements that I think Geelong can benefit from. And so I now have 15 recommendations, and thankfully, a lot of them you've seen before, so I'll actually move quite quickly through these, and I apologise that there's a lot, but they're ones that you hopefully won't be surprised to hear. So the first is about the connecting the displaced workers, especially women and the young, into targeted programs, building on existing programs that we know we're really good at, like Skilling the Bay, in the partnerships, connecting with the training providers with the employers. We've got great models on how to do that. Boosting onshore manufacturing through a suite of policy interventions to support that, and the collaborations that have produced the expansion in manufacturing up to this point, and I won't read the whole lot out. Capitalise on the attraction of the non-metropolitan areas, so really go for a marketing campaign into Melbourne, and I know it's already about to roll out or is rolling out, and sort of do that not just to people but to businesses. And that's not just about tourism, it's a small element, it's actually about people relocating. Seize the opportunity to build a better, greener economy, explore this idea of becoming a site for the Zero Emissions Million Jobs Project, build on the health and research elements with this whole idea of Barwon Health, the university, very strong in health, got lots of really good other organisations to make a bid for a national centre for disease control, or at least boost the various health research operations that are in Geelong already, because we have a great foundation for those, to build that sort of scientific foundation even further, the smart specialisation idea. Driving the tourism through this idea of the health charter, and also offer a range of different products and very much pick up on the Indigenous aspect of the Geelong offerings, as well as the cultural, the food and wine, and the natural environment, of course. The idea of the creative industries, but also the high streets. And so I'm very much about this idea of the 10-minute neighbourhood, to reactivate the high streets, not just the CBD, revisit the Renew Geelong idea, and use that to both reactivate CBD activities but vacant retail and industrial spaces elsewhere. Accelerate the social housing agenda and build on the existing initiatives there. Build on the home-based work, and that goes back to the high streets, and not just existing not just new areas that might be opened up, but existing areas, to boost not just their retail activity, but also to boost them as centres of work, of co-working spaces, and extend what goes on in retail centres, the high streets, in both existing and new areas. Improve the commute. Thank you very much. A couple of $100 million has been thrown at that for slightly faster rail. So again, this idea that commuting is not to be feared in Geelong. It is something to be embraced because it really is the population inflow, allowing that flexibility of both working in Geelong but also outside of Geelong, living in Geelong, going elsewhere to work. It's a winner for all of the localities, and I think that's a trend that will really accelerate as well. Final page, I promise. Pursue the active transport, the 10-15 minute neighbourhood, the neighbourhood centres that are not just in the new areas, but also in smaller existing areas. This idea of the 10 to 15 minute neighbourhood through also creative, innovative urban design, and perhaps thinking very differently about how we activate these neighbourhood centres. And even think about the idea of a decentralisation from the CBD of Geelong. You may not wish to go there, but the idea of having satellite government hubs in some localities around Geelong, like satellites around Geelong, so not everything concentrated in the CBD of Geelong, which of course is also suffering not quite as badly as the CBD of Melbourne, but it is an issue even for Geelong. And then we have the last few points around the social and spatial disadvantage of particular areas. And we know that GROW exists, Skilling the Bay, Northern Futures, very much work in areas of disadvantage. The social housing agenda is going to, of course, help on that front, but we can certainly do it far more actively around employment, and we've got really good programs here to boost employment for long-term and recently displaced workers, as well as, of course, improving these environments. And finally, I urge you to maintain a united political front. Effective lobbying is what has basically delivered a lot of the good news story that I think Geelong tells in terms of its resilience. So maintaining that united voice to lobby effectively in Melbourne and Canberra, and obviously that's already happening with the whole post-COVID recovery group. And you'll be relieved to know I am done.